Now, we all know that Lies of P has a huge amount of weapon variety, especially as you can disassemble and reassemble the standard weapons in the game, making some incredibly overpowered weapons, but there are some unique weapons in the game that cannot be disassembled, which are the boss weapons. As with pretty much every Souls-like game, once you beat particular bosses, they will grant you their souls, or in this case, Ergo for Lies of P, where you can then trade that with a specialist vendor to get their weapons. These boss weapons tend to have special abilities or different movesets that are not on the standard weapons in the game and make you feel like a damn boss when using them. We're going to be taking a look at the top 5 boss weapons that you can get in Lies of P, not only to obliterate every single enemy that you see, but also have an immense amount of fun. So if you're excited for that, make sure you hit that like button down below, and also by hitting that like button you let me know that you want to see more videos like this. And if you're new around here or find yourself returning to the channel to watch these kinds of videos, why not subscribe? It's free. That way you can stay up to date and be notified when these videos are released. But with all that said, it is now time to jump into this crazy top 5 and find out which boss weapons are the best. Kicking things off in the number 5 spot is going to be the Puppet Ripper. Now, this is the weapon that you get by defeating the Puppet King, or Romeo the Puppet King, in chapter 6 of the game, so it is a fairly mid-game weapon. Obviously, other than just giving the Grim Reaper vibes and being a mechanical scythe, with charged heavy attacks and a certain fable art that we'll talk about in a moment, you swing the end of the weapon around in a circular motion, dealing damage to anybody in your near vicinity. This is obviously great when traversing through certain areas where you can just essentially run in the middle, charge up your heavy attack, and attack everything on your screen, even those that are not on your screen and standing behind you. As you can see from the gameplay in the background, it maybe doesn't seem like it's a weapon that's going to stun a lot of enemies, or at least not be hitting heavily enough, but in fact it does do quite well at breaking stances, even if you are just flailing your weapon around in the air. The only unfortunate thing about it, and the reason why it finds itself in the number 5 spot, is it isn't the most damaging weapon in the game, only really doing about 600 to 800 damage with that charged sort of final attack. So if you hit with both of them, you're going to be doing a surplus of 1200 damage. And the 2 fable arts, both quick upward slash and the storm spinning slash, also don't do a tremendous amount of damage. Of course, I'm just talking about the raw damage that you can get out of this weapon, because if you do use talismans, such as the Arm of God amulet to boost your damage with every successful attack, then you can ramp this up a little bit more. But even the quick upward slash, so the first attacking fable art, will still only do around about 3000 damage with a successful hit. And then the secondary fable art, which again is an attacking fable art, the spinning slash, again similarly will do around about 3000 damage, but this one can be interrupted fairly easily. Don't get me wrong, it's extremely cool going around as the puppet equivalent of the Grim Reaper, but in reality you're a bit more closer to a Beyblade than you are the Grim Reaper, dealing somewhat okay damage in the meantime. So yeah, purely down to damage and I guess sort of the movesets with this, that's why it finds itself in the number 5 spot. But of course, swiftly moving on from that, going into number 4, we have got ourselves the Frozen Feast. Now this weapon is actually obtained by defeating the next boss in the game after getting the Puppet Ripper, and that is Champion Victor in chapter 7. The unique thing about this greatsword is that it gets quicker over time. So you can see at the beginning, this weapon looks like it's been taken from a slab of rock and had a stick put on the end of it, but when you start to use it, you then start to unveil the actual blade underneath, and after 4 attacks it becomes fully unveiled and the weapon then becomes a bit quicker to use. With this weapon being a greatsword, of course it's perfect to bonk your enemies' heads with, especially running up on them with a charged heavy, obliterating pretty much most enemies with one foul swoop. But realistically, other than the gimmick of obviously getting rid of those rocks and making the weapon move slightly faster, it is no real different to any other greatsword that you can get in the entire game. I feel that they slightly missed the mark with the gimmick that they were going for, and rather than just amping up the speed ever so slightly, they probably could have had, I don't know, maybe like a critical hit. Doesn't have to be say 30%, but maybe even just 10-15 would be really cool to have a extra bit of damage be applied every now and again. But realistically, other than just having a slightly, and I mean slightly faster moveset, there's no real other benefit to having this weapon. The first fable art, Liberate, will essentially allow you to get rid of of the rocks on the weapon straight away rather than having to hit 4 different enemies to have full access to the faster attacks basically straight away. And then the secondary Fable Art, Single Slash, is again just another generic sort of heavy attack which will only do about 3 to 3,500 damage. This weapon just seems to fall and fall and fall down the pecking order in terms of OP weapons in the game. But of course, saying that, it is still a better choice for me than the Puppet Ripper, just because you can deal obviously that heavier damage, and if a couple of enemies are in front of you, it is a great sword, so it will reach multiple enemies in one swing, which is why it literally just about pips it to the full spot. But I just wish that this weapon had a lot more to give, because the next 3 weapons that I'm going to talk about are just levels above. And kicking off this juicy top 3, in the 3rd spot we've got the Trident of the Covenant. So the first weapon to feature on this list with a critical rate, so you have a chance of dealing extra damage, in this case a 30% chance. So in theory, with each attack that you do, you've got essentially a 1 in 3 chance of it doing additional damage. So straight away, even with just the base damage, you're going to be doing similar to what we were seeing with the Frozen Feast, and then obviously mixing it in with that critical rate, you could be doing a little bit more. It's also a quicker weapon, and it has a slightly better range. Where it's a thrusting weapon, especially if you're using a charged heavy, you thrust towards your enemies, covering quite a large amount of ground, allowing you to essentially charge this attack up well away from your enemies to then run up to them and deal a substantial amount of damage. Its Fable Arts, Link Rush Stab and Guard Parry are also really cool to use in the game. Link Rush Stab is a more unique Fable Art where you essentially have 2 phases of it. First one, running up to your enemy, stabbing them, but then if you press Y again, you will then do a leap up in the air, crushing your enemies when you come back down. But then equally, in a defensive situation, you've also got Guard Parry. It's one of the cooler sort of defensive Fable Arts in the game, because if you can time the block correctly, you will not only perform a perfect block, but you will also then deal a heavy hitting attack, doing about 1500 damage straight after it. And the fact that you've also got a defensive Fable Art on this weapon allows you to use it a bit more free-flowing in battle. So if you do want to lure your enemies out and punish them, you can obviously do that as well. And then when you rack up enough Fable Art to unleash the Link Rush Stab, you can literally hit them at range, lunging forward to them and dealing heavy damage with that. I also seem to have a good rate of breaking enemy stances with this weapon, so that's another good thing about it as well. So this weapon is just really good. And I also forgot to mention, you can get it fairly early on in the game by defeating the fallen Archbishop at the end of chapter 4. So for a weapon that you can get much earlier than the previous 2, and one that is a lot more effective, this is why it finds itself in the number 3 spot. There are 2 weapons that I consider to be better than the Trident, and the one that's going to come in at 2nd place is none other than the Proof of Humanity. This is a weapon that you get at the very end of the game by defeating a secret boss named the Nameless Puppet. And again, without spoiling too much, you get 2 choices at the end of the game whether or not to give a certain someone a certain something, and depending on your choice, you either do not fight the puppet or you do. And if you do fight the puppet and beat him, you will then be rewarded with his weapon that probably tore you apart yourself. And that's because it also possesses the same critical rate as the Trident did, but is a much quicker weapon. It has a unique moveset, especially if you're using charged attacks like a charged heavy, but the weapon will then split into 2. So rather than doing say 2 swings of the sword, you are then doing 4. And with the same critical rate, obviously being a 1 in 3 essentially, this can make for some deadly RNG luck if you manage to hit them in quick succession. And where it's just a standard sword rather than say like a greatsword or a hammer or anything like that, you can chain these attacks one after the other, dealing constant heavy amounts of damage. But if that critical rate of 30 wasn't enough whilst you're doing all of those attacks, the secondary Fable Art Grind increases that critical rate dramatically, essentially making it a 1 in 3 chance to not hit with a critical hit. This of course just makes the weapon even more deadlier, and the fact that it only takes 1 Fable slot to use that effect is just ridiculous. And then if you've still got 3 Fable Arts to use the Link Slash ability, so the first primary Fable Art, you'll be hitting your enemies about 7 or 8 times, obviously potentially doing upwards of 5,000 damage just with that alone. The only real thing about this weapon, and the reason why it's at number 2, is purely because the weapon is only got from the secret boss at the end of the game. So I know obviously fans of the game like myself are probably going to go on to New Game Plus, but for the vast majority of people, they've probably played the game once, maybe might go into New Game Plus to say get all the rest of the achievements that they might have missed, and if they didn't choose to fight the puppet at the end, then obviously they'll be missing out on this weapon. And also if you're just playing it for the one time and want to just experience the game, if you do choose to fight the puppet and defeat it, you've pretty much completed the whole game. And where there's no multiplayer aspect or anything like that, the only reason why you would want to use this weapon is to rinse New Game Plus, and if you're not one to do that, then yeah, this weapon is ultimately somewhat useless. But like I say, for those of us that are going into New Game Plus and want to experience the game, this weapon is extremely useful and extremely powerful, of course, but essentially this weapon finds itself in the number 2 spot, mainly because it's the last weapon that you can get, and the damage output is just not as good as this next weapon I'm going to talk about, and the weapon in the number 1 spot can also be obtained as early as chapter 3. Of course, the weapon that is going to be in that number 1 spot is the Holy Sword of the Ark. You get this by defeating the King's Flame Fuego, and the gimmick with this weapon is it's not just one weapon that you're getting essentially, it's 2, because if you didn't know, and this is obviously unique to this weapon, the Fable Art Altar will change the length of the weapon, and depending on whether or not you've made it the longer version or the shorter version, you will then have different benefits and also different Fable Arts applied to that weapon. So if you have the shortened version of the weapon, you will then have the Fable Art Patient Smash, which is the charged up heavy attack which will then make your character move towards that enemy to then release an ungodly amount of damage. But if you've used the Altar Fable Art and have extended the weapon, it then becomes more of a storm slash ability with chained attack as long as you've got enough Fable Art to use it 3 times, hitting your enemies with 5 different slashes, ultimately ending with a heavy slash. But the benefits obviously don't stop there. When you do alter it, going from short to long, you then have about 15 seconds where your stamina consumption is reduced, meaning that you can obviously chain more attacks whilst having a longer weapon to hit enemies at much further ranges, which of course is brilliant for getting through certain areas, defeating enemies before they can even get close to you. And then if you go back to the shortened version of the weapon, your weapon is then infused for about 10 seconds with the same Fable Art as Strike Chance, the one that's on the crap police baton, significantly increasing your next attack with this weapon. And with the Fable Art then returning to Patient Smash, which can be charged up, you are then going to be able to do in excess of about 6, 7, potentially even 8,000 damage against any enemy in your way. And the fact that you get this weapon so early on in your game is just ridiculous. I know that this thing carried me throughout my whole playthrough and I didn't have any problems whatsoever. And just the outright ridiculous damage that you can do with it, again, is why it finds itself at the number 1 spot. I know it's probably a little bit controversial putting this ahead of the Proof of Humanity, but I'm being serious when I say I'd rather have this than the Proof of Humanity, because apart from bosses, I can essentially one-shot any enemy in the entire game. And the Charged Heavy with this weapon will one-shot all regular puppets, carcasses in the game anyway, so it truly is a one-shot machine. And there you have it. I know it got a little bit controversial probably towards the end there, but that is the list of my top 5 boss weapons that you can get in Lies of P. Of course, feel free to let me know in the comments if I've got that badly wrong or if you guys completely disagree with the list, but that is genuinely my top 5 weapons, and if you haven't used any of these yet, I definitely suggest that you go and give them a try because you'll have an immense amount of fun with them, I know that for sure. And if you are playing the game for the first time and have maybe used some of the Ergos to get different talismans rather than the weapons, don't worry, because you can somewhat match the absolute powerful weapons that you're seeing here just using the standard weapons and mixing the right handles with the right heads. So if you want to see that, head over to the previous top 5 weapons that we had a look at, which show you the top 5 weapon combinations using the standard weapons in the game. Also, just talking about that previous video, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to everyone that's shown so much support over there recently. It's getting a lot of love and attention at the moment, so I couldn't be any more thankful to you lot watching, liking, commenting, subscribing, interacting with the channel in any way possible. So I just want to say a big thank you for doing that. And of course, if you happen to enjoy this, make sure you're hitting the like button. It's the best way to tell me that you want to see more videos like this. I know we've done sort of like the top 5 weapons, but I can always go and show you different weapons and different builds around a certain boss weapon or anything like that. So if you want to see more Lies of P content, make sure you're hitting that like button. Make sure you're subscribing as well, so that way you don't miss out. But yeah, that is everything from me, guys. So thank you again for watching this particular video. I hope you're all doing well, and I guess for now, I'll see you in the next video of whatever it is that we make. Bye bye.